It was just after 2:30 in the morning on October 4th, 1978, in the quiet city of Sacramento, California. The streets were almost empty. A light fog drifted slowly through the neighborhoods, wrapping the silent houses in a pale gray haze. Officer David Peterson had been on patrol for several hours. It had been a quiet shift, too quiet. As he drove down Watt Avenue, something unusual caught his attention. A car door was open. The vehicle was parked awkwardly along the curb, its interior light glowing faintly in the darkness. Peterson slowed the patrol car. At first, it looked like someone had simply forgotten to close the door. But as he stepped out and approached the vehicle, something about the scene felt wrong. Very wrong. The driver's seat was empty, but the ground beside the car was stained. Dark. Wet. Blood. Peterson's pulse quickened as he scanned the area with his flashlight. The beam swept across the pavement, then stopped. Just a few feet away, partially hidden by the shadows, lay the body of a young woman. Her clothes were torn. Her face was bruised, and her throat had been cut. The silence of the street suddenly felt heavier. Within minutes, backup units arrived. Detectives secured the area. Crime scene tape stretched across the quiet road. But as investigators studied the scene, one chilling realization began to take shape. This was not a random act of violence. This was something far darker. And they were standing at the beginning of what would become one of the most disturbing killing sprees in American criminal history. A case that would force investigators to confront a terrifying truth about the human mind. Because the man responsible for these crimes didn't look like a monster. He looked ordinary. His name was Randy Stephen Kraft. And behind his calm, polite appearance was a mind capable of cruelty that many investigators would later struggle to comprehend. Randy Kraft was born on March 19, 1945, in Long Beach, California. To neighbors, the Kraft family looked normal. His father worked as a warehouse supervisor. His mother stayed home to raise the children. They lived in a modest suburban house where everything appeared quiet and stable. From the outside, there was nothing alarming about Randy's childhood. He was described as intelligent, polite, well-behaved. Teachers often said he was one of the brightest students in class. He had a strong memory and an unusual ability to absorb information quickly. But there were also signs that something inside him was different. Randy kept to himself. He rarely formed deep friendships. Instead, he preferred spending time alone, reading books or working on electronics. As he grew older, that emotional distance became more noticeable. While other teenagers socialized and experimented with relationships, Randy seemed detached. Observers would later describe him as cold. Not openly aggressive, just emotionally absent. After graduating from high school with excellent grades, Randy enrolled at Claremont Men's College. There he studied economics and became involved in political organizations during the turbulent 1960s. At first, his future seemed promising. But behind the surface, his personal life was becoming complicated. During college, Randy began to acknowledge something he had kept hidden for years. He was attracted to men. In the late 1960s, being openly gay in America carried enormous social pressure. For Randy, this realization deepened his sense of isolation. Some acquaintances later said he seemed frustrated, even angry about his identity. But no one could have imagined where that internal conflict might lead. After college, Randy briefly worked for a computer company. He appeared stable, responsible, calm. But in the early 1970s, something inside him began to change. Authorities would later struggle to determine exactly when his violent fantasies first began. But evidence suggested that by the early part of the decade, Randy Kraft had already crossed a line that most people would never even approach. His victims were usually young men, many of them hitchhikers, runaways, or men who lived on the edges of society. People who might disappear without immediate attention. He would pick them up along highways in California, offer them a ride, sometimes a drink, sometimes drugs, and then slowly, the situation would turn deadly. Investigators later discovered that many victims had been drugged, paralyzed, unable to fight back. Some were tortured, others were strangled. Several had been mutilated in ways that left detectives deeply disturbed. These were not crimes committed in panic. They were controlled, methodical, and carefully concealed. The bodies began appearing across California. Highway embankments, desert areas, remote roadside ditches. At first, the cases seemed unrelated. Different cities, different counties, different police departments. Each discovery appeared to be a separate tragedy. But slowly, investigators began to notice similarities. Young male victims, evidence of restraint, and signs of extreme cruelty. The media eventually gave the unknown killer a chilling nickname: the scorecard killer. Because when police eventually searched Randy Kraft's belongings, they would find something deeply unsettling. A coded list. More than 60 cryptic entries. Each line believed to represent a victim. Names replaced with strange phrases. Silent records of lives that had been taken. But in the late 1970s, investigators did not yet know who they were hunting. They only knew that someone was moving across California, leaving death behind him. Year after year, victims continued to appear. In 1973, the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Detectives from multiple jurisdictions began sharing information, but the killer remained invisible. He had no criminal record for violent offenses, no obvious connection to the victims, and he appeared to move through society unnoticed. Friends described him as polite, soft-spoken, even charming. He worked stable jobs, paid his bills, maintained relationships. Nothing about him matched the image most people had of a serial killer, which made the truth even more disturbing. Because the man responsible for these murders was living an ordinary life while secretly committing acts of unimaginable cruelty. By 1983, the number of victims connected to the case had grown dramatically. Investigators feared the real total might be far higher than what had been discovered. But the breakthrough would come unexpectedly. Late one evening on May 14, 1983, two California Highway Patrol officers were driving along Interstate 5 near Mission Viejo. They noticed a car swerving slightly across the lane. It wasn't extreme, but enough to draw attention. The officers pulled the vehicle over. The driver appeared calm. His name was Randy Kraft. As the officers spoke with him, they noticed something strange. A strong smell of alcohol. But also something else. The passenger in the front seat wasn't moving. At first glance, the man looked unconscious, perhaps passed out from drinking. But when the officers shined a flashlight into the car, the truth became clear. The passenger was dead. His body was slumped unnaturally, his face pale, and around his neck were clear marks of strangulation. The officers immediately placed Kraft under arrest. But what they would discover next would shock even experienced investigators. When police searched the vehicle, they found photographs. Graphic photographs. images of young men who appeared unconscious or worse. They found restraints, alcohol, drugs, and in Kraft's briefcase. The coded list, the so-called scorecard, dozens of mysterious entries, each one believed to represent a victim. The investigation that followed uncovered a horrifying timeline of violence stretching back more than a decade. Bodies discovered across California and Oregon were linked to Kraft. Forensic evidence connected him to multiple murders. Witnesses placed him with several victims shortly before they disappeared. And the disturbing photographs suggested the crimes had been carefully documented. During the trial, prosecutors presented evidence connecting Randy Kraft to at least 16 murders. But investigators believed the true number could be far higher, possibly more than 60. The courtroom listened as forensic experts described the injuries suffered by the victims. The drugging, the torture, the deliberate cruelty. Jurors struggled to comprehend the level of violence involved. The defense argued that Kraft's former partner might have been responsible for some of the crimes. But the evidence told a different story. The coded scorecard, the photographs, the victims found along routes Kraft frequently traveled. Piece by piece, the prosecution built a picture of a man who had spent years hunting vulnerable young men across the highways of California. A man who had managed to hide in plain sight. In 1989, after a long and emotionally draining trial, the jury delivered its verdict. Guilty. Randy Stephen Kraft was convicted of 16 counts of murder. He was sentenced to death. Today, he remains on death row at San Quentin State Prison. And investigators still believe many of the names on that coded scorecard have never been fully identified, which means the true number of victims may never be known. But even decades later, one disturbing question continues to haunt the case. How could someone who appeared so normal, so quiet, so invisible, carry out such calculated cruelty for so many years without being stopped? Because sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones who learn how to look exactly like everyone else. The investigation into Randy Kraft did not end with the guilty verdict. In many ways, that was only the beginning. Because once the courtroom lights dimmed and the trial concluded, detectives were left with a haunting problem. The scorecard. That strange coded list found in Kraft's briefcase contained more than 60 entries. But during the trial, prosecutors had only been able to directly link 16 murders to him, which meant dozens of possible victims remained unidentified. And somewhere across the western United States, there could be families who never even knew what truly happened to their missing sons. Investigators spent years studying the list. Each entry appeared to be a short phrase, sometimes a name, sometimes something cryptic. EDM, drug stop, Portland, Marine Head, Angel. At first glance, the list made no sense. But detectives believed these phrases were personal references only Kraft would understand. Clues tied to specific victims or specific locations. In several cases, the entries on the scorecard appeared to match known victims. One of those victims was a young Marine named Lance Taggs. His body had been discovered in 1978 near Interstate 5. Taggs had been strangled, but investigators noticed something deeply disturbing about the condition of his body. He had been heavily intoxicated before his death. Toxicology reports later revealed extremely high levels of alcohol and tranquilizers. Evidence suggested the victim had been deliberately drugged until he was completely helpless. And Lance Taggs was not the only one. Again and again, investigators discovered similar patterns among the victims connected to Kraft. Young men, often hitchhikers, many of them military personnel stationed in California. Others were runaways or drifters who had little connection to family. People who might not be reported missing right away. In several cases, the victims were last seen getting into a car with a man matching Kraft's description. A polite man, well-dressed, driving a tidy vehicle. A man who seemed trustworthy. The kind of person no one would suspect. That was part of what made the crimes so effective. Kraft did not look dangerous. He did not behave like someone planning violence. Instead, he presented himself as friendly, helpful, sometimes even charming. Investigators later believed that once the victims were inside the car, Kraft would offer them alcohol, or sometimes pills. The drugs he used often included powerful sedatives, substances capable of leaving someone barely conscious, unable to resist. From that moment on, the victims had almost no chance of survival. Some of the victims died from strangulation. Others showed evidence of suffocation. But in many cases, investigators discovered something even more disturbing. Several victims appeared to have been tortured for extended periods of time before death. Burn marks, ligature wounds, evidence of repeated assault. These were not quick killings. They were deliberate acts of cruelty. Acts that suggested the killer was not simply trying to eliminate witnesses. He was deriving something darker from the suffering. Psychological satisfaction. Control. Power. During the trial, forensic specialists testified that some victims may have still been alive during the earliest stages of the abuse. That detail left many people in the courtroom visibly shaken. Even seasoned detectives admitted later that this case was one of the most disturbing investigations they had ever encountered. But the most chilling discovery came from the photographs. When police searched Kraft's home and car, they found dozens of images. Some were photographs of young men lying unconscious. Others were far more graphic. Several victims appeared to have been posed, almost like trophies. Evidence that the killer wanted to preserve the memory of what he had done. For investigators, these images became crucial pieces of evidence because they allowed them to identify victims who had previously been unknown. But the photographs also raised a terrifying possibility. If Kraft had been documenting his crimes, how many victims were there that had never been discovered? The investigation began stretching across multiple states. California, Oregon, Michigan. Some detectives even began examining cases from Arizona and Washington. Bodies discovered near highways. Unidentified victims found in rural areas. Missing persons who had last been seen hitchhiking along interstate routes. Little by little, the pieces began to connect. And the timeline stretched back further than anyone expected. Some evidence suggested Kraft may have begun killing as early as 1971. That meant he had potentially been active for more than 12 years before his arrest. 12 years of traveling highways, picking up strangers, and leaving bodies behind. During interviews after his conviction, Kraft refused to confess. He remained calm, detached, almost clinical in his responses. He insisted he was innocent. At times, he suggested that former acquaintances might have been responsible for some of the murders. But investigators never found convincing evidence supporting that claim. Instead, the physical evidence pointed repeatedly back to him. The photographs, the scorecard, witness accounts, and the body found in his passenger seat the night he was arrested. One detective later described that moment as the turning point. If those officers had not stopped Randy Kraft that night, The killings might have continued. More victims, more bodies, more names on that scorecard. Even today, decades after his arrest, investigators still work to identify potential victims connected to the list. Some of the entries remain unsolved, unmatched to any known victim, which means somewhere there may still be families searching for answers. Families who lost someone along the highways of the western United States and never knew why. The case forced investigators and psychologists to confront a deeply unsettling truth. Randy Kraft was not driven by rage, or desperation, or sudden impulse. His crimes appeared organized, controlled, planned, which suggested something far more chilling. He enjoyed it. That realization led to a question that still troubles criminal profilers today. How does someone capable of such calculated cruelty manage to hide so completely within normal society? Neighbors described Kraft as quiet, friendly, polite. Coworkers said he was intelligent and responsible. No one described him as violent or unstable. And yet behind that calm exterior was a man capable of torturing and killing dozens of people. A man who kept a secret list of victims as if they were personal achievements. A man who drove the highways at night, looking for strangers who trusted him for just a few minutes. Long enough to climb into his car. Long enough to disappear forever. Today, Randy Kraft sits in a cell on death row. His life reduced to a small concrete room inside San Quentin State Prison. But the echoes of his crimes still remain. In cold case files, in missing persons reports, and in the unanswered questions that investigators may never fully solve. Because somewhere on that coded scorecard, there may still be names the world has never heard. Lives that vanished without explanation. Stories that ended on a dark highway. And perhaps the most disturbing truth of all is that if two highway patrol officers had not noticed a car drifting slightly across the lane on a quiet California night in 1983, the man responsible for those crimes might still be out there, driving through the darkness, looking for his next victim. Even after the trial ended, the story refused to disappear. Because the deeper investigators looked into Randy Kraft's past, the more disturbing the picture became. Detectives began reconstructing his movements during the 1970s and early 1980s. They studied employment records, apartment leases, travel routes, credit card receipts. Every small detail mattered. And slowly, a pattern began to emerge. Kraft spent a large portion of his time driving long distances across California. Sometimes for work, sometimes for reasons that no one could clearly explain. But many of those routes followed the same highways where bodies had been discovered. Interstate 5, Pacific Coast Highway, remote rural roads where hitchhikers often waited for rides. Investigators began to suspect that Kraft had been carefully selecting victims who were unlikely to be traced quickly. Young men traveling alone. Men who trusted strangers. Men who disappeared without witnesses. Some were military personnel stationed at nearby bases. Others were young drifters who had left home looking for work or adventure. Some were teenagers who had run away from troubled families. And when those young men vanished, their disappearances were not always immediately reported. Sometimes days passed, sometimes weeks. In a few tragic cases, months went by before families realized something had gone terribly wrong. By then, the trail was already cold. One of the most chilling aspects of the case was the level of planning investigators believed Kraft used. He appeared to carry drugs with him during many of his encounters. Sedatives, Powerful tranquilizers. Substances capable of rendering someone barely conscious. Detectives believed he often offered these drugs under the pretense of sharing alcohol or recreational pills. But once the victim was incapacitated, the real nightmare began. Several victims showed signs that they had been kept alive for hours before death. The injuries were not random. They were systematic, cruel, calculated. Evidence suggested that Kraft sometimes drove long distances while his victims lay unconscious beside him. A silent passenger, trapped, completely helpless. In some cases, forensic evidence suggested the abuse continued even after death. That detail haunted many of the detectives who worked the case. One investigator later admitted that reviewing the photographs taken from Kraft's possessions was one of the most disturbing experiences of his career. The images were not taken in panic. They were taken deliberately, as if the killer wanted to preserve the moment. Almost like someone documenting an event they considered important. To many investigators, that detail revealed something deeply unsettling about Kraft's psychology. These were not crimes driven by sudden anger. They were acts of control, acts of domination, and acts of cruelty carried out slowly, with patience, and with intention. But even as the investigation uncovered more evidence, the full truth remained frustratingly incomplete. Because Randy Kraft refused to cooperate. Unlike some serial killers who eventually confess or seek attention, Kraft remained almost completely silent about the crimes. He maintained his innocence. He denied responsibility. And he never explained the meaning of the scorecard. That silence created an enormous challenge for investigators. Without a confession, linking every possible victim became extremely difficult. Cold case detectives spent years comparing the phrases from the scorecard with unsolved murders and missing persons reports. Sometimes the clues matched. Sometimes they didn't. One entry appeared to reference a victim found near Portland, Oregon. Another seemed connected to a young Marine whose body had been discovered near a military base. But many entries remain mysterious. 2 words, a strange phrase, a location, a nickname, fragments of meaning locked inside the mind of a man who refused to speak. And with every passing year, the chances of identifying those victims grew smaller. Witnesses moved away. Memories faded. Evidence deteriorated. Some victims may never be identified. Some families may never know what happened to the person they lost. For the detectives who worked the case, that uncertainty became one of the most painful parts of the investigation. Because the numbers alone were terrifying. 16 murders proven in court. More than 60 suspected. Which meant Randy Kraft could be responsible for one of the highest victim counts of any serial killer in American history. And yet, many people had never even heard his name. Perhaps because his crimes were so disturbing. Or perhaps because the victims themselves were often forgotten by society. Young men without powerful voices to demand justice. But the reality of the case left investigators with a deeply uncomfortable question. How many killers like this might exist without being noticed? Randy Kraft managed to hide in plain sight for more than a decade. He had friends, coworkers, neighbors, people who saw him almost every day. And none of them suspected that he might be responsible for dozens of brutal murders. That truth forced psychologists and criminal profilers to rethink some long-held assumptions. The idea that killers always appear strange, unstable, or visibly dangerous. In many cases, the opposite can be true. Some of the most dangerous individuals learn to blend perfectly into ordinary life. They understand how people expect them to behave, and they perform that role flawlessly, until the mask finally slips. For Randy Kraft, that moment came on a quiet California highway. A routine traffic stop. Two officers noticing a car drifting slightly out of its lane. A minor suspicion. A simple decision to pull the vehicle over. That small moment changed everything. Because when the flashlight beam illuminated the passenger seat, the truth was sitting right there. A body. Silent. Cold. And the man behind the wheel, calm and expressionless. Even today, decades later, investigators still reflect on how close the case came to continuing indefinitely. If that traffic stop had never happened, how many more names would have been added to that scorecard? How many more victims would have vanished along those dark highways? No one can answer that question. But one thing remains certain. The case left behind a chilling reminder. Evil does not always announce itself. Sometimes it hides behind polite smiles, normal routines, and quiet suburban lives. And sometimes the only thing that finally stops it is a small moment of suspicion on a dark road in the middle of the night. A moment that reveals the truth no one wanted to imagine. That the person sitting calmly behind the wheel was capable of questioning humanity itself. Years passed after the conviction, but the shadow of the case never truly disappeared. Inside law enforcement archives across California and Oregon, thick folders remain stacked with photographs, reports, and missing person files connected to the investigation. Each file represented a life, a story that ended abruptly. And for many of those cases, the ending was still uncertain. Detectives continued to review the evidence long after Randy Kraft had been placed on death row. Every few years, advancements in forensic science offered new possibilities. DNA technology improved. Fingerprint databases expanded. Old evidence that once seemed useless suddenly had the potential to reveal answers. Cold case investigators reopened several files connected to the suspected victims on Kraft's scorecard. In some cases, they managed to confirm identities that had remained unknown for years. Unidentified remains, found decades earlier, were finally matched to missing persons. Families that had spent years living with uncertainty were finally given the truth. But for other entries on the list, the mystery remained. Some victims had been discovered in such remote areas that investigators struggled to determine where they had originally come from. Others had left home without telling anyone. Young men traveling the country. Drifters. Hitchhikers. People who slipped through the cracks of society. For those victims, there were often no fingerprints on file. No dental records. No missing person report waiting to be matched. Just a body discovered beside a highway. And a cryptic phrase written on a killer's scorecard. During interviews conducted years after the trial, several detectives described the emotional toll the case had taken on them. Many had worked homicide investigations for decades. They had seen violence before. But this case was different. It was the scale, the cruelty, the cold calculation behind the crimes. One investigator later said that what disturbed him the most was not just the murders themselves, but the patience involved. Kraft had not acted in sudden bursts of rage. He hunted. Slowly. Methodically. Sometimes weeks passed between victims. Other times months. He appeared to live a normal life between the crimes. Working. Socializing. Attending gatherings. While somewhere inside his mind, the next victim was already being imagined. Psychologists who studied the case pointed to several possible explanations for his behavior. Some believed he displayed traits of extreme psychopathy, a personality structure defined by lack of empathy, manipulation, and emotional detachment. Others believed the crimes were fueled by a need for absolute control, a desire to dominate another human being completely. Whatever the explanation, one disturbing truth became clear. The violence was not accidental. It was deliberate. Every element of the crimes suggested planning. The drugs, the restraints, the photographs, even the scorecard itself. A quiet record of death hidden inside a briefcase. Years later, journalists who attempted to interview Randy Kraft described him as calm, almost unnervingly calm. He rarely showed emotion. He spoke carefully, deliberately, and he continued to deny responsibility for the murders. He insisted that investigators had misunderstood the evidence, that other people might have been involved. But those claims never convinced the detectives who had spent years studying the case. Because the physical evidence was overwhelming. The body in the passenger seat, the photographs, the coded list, and the long trail of victims discovered along the highways he traveled. Even today, Randy Kraft remains incarcerated at San Quentin State Prison in California. His appeals have continued for decades. The legal process moves slowly in death penalty cases. Some inmates spend the rest of their lives on death row, and it is possible that Kraft may never face execution. Instead, he may spend the remainder of his life inside the prison walls. A man whose secrets may never be fully revealed. For the families of the victims, the pain did not end with the conviction. Many of them still live with unanswered questions. Some still do not know whether their missing loved one was connected to the case. Others know the truth, but struggle to understand why it happened. Why their son? Why their brother? Why someone who simply accepted a ride from a stranger? The highways where many of the bodies were found still carry thousands of travelers every day. Cars rushing past. Drivers focused on reaching their destinations. Most of them unaware that decades earlier, those same roads had been silent witnesses to something far darker. Late at night, when traffic fades and the road grows quiet, it is easy to imagine those lonely stretches of highway exactly as they once were. A single car pulling over. A stranger offering a ride. A brief moment of trust. And then disappearance. For investigators who work the case, one thought has always remained deeply unsettling. Randy Kraft was eventually caught, but he operated undetected for more than a decade, which raises a chilling possibility. How many other killers have traveled those same highways and never been stopped? How many crimes remain hidden simply because the right moment of suspicion never occurred? The truth is that many of the names on Randy Kraft's scorecard may never be matched to real identities. Their stories ended in silence, their final moments known only to the man who refused to speak. And perhaps that is what makes this case so disturbing. Not just the violence, not just the cruelty, but the realization that the person responsible lived among ordinary people for years, driving the same roads, shopping at the same stores, speaking politely to neighbors, while secretly committing acts that forced investigators to question something far deeper than a single crime. They began to question the nature of humanity itself. Because sometimes the line between normal life and unimaginable darkness is far thinner than anyone wants to believe. And sometimes the most terrifying truth is this: the monster was never hiding in the shadows. He was sitting in the driver's seat the entire time, smiling, waiting, and no one noticed. Until it was far too late. Even after decades, the case still echoes through the halls of law enforcement agencies. Boxes of evidence remain stored in climate-controlled archives. Inside those boxes are photographs, maps, laboratory reports, and handwritten notes from detectives who spent years chasing answers. Some of those investigators have long since retired. Others have passed away. But the case itself has never truly closed. Because Randy Kraft was never just one investigation. He was dozens. Maybe more. Every victim represented a separate story, a separate life, and a separate moment when everything went terribly wrong. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, cold case units began revisiting the evidence with new forensic tools. DNA testing had advanced dramatically. What once required large samples could now be done with microscopic traces. Detectives hoped that these new techniques might finally solve the remaining mysteries connected to the scorecard. Sometimes they succeeded. In a few cases, unidentified remains discovered decades earlier were finally matched to missing persons. For families who had spent years wondering what happened, the news brought a complicated mixture of grief and closure. The truth was painful, but uncertainty had been worse. One mother told investigators that she had always believed her son was still alive somewhere, living under a different name. Starting over, it had been the only way she could cope with the disappearance. When the identification finally came, she described the moment as devastating, but also strangely relieving. At least now she knew. At least now she could stop waiting. But not every family received that answer. Many entries on the scorecard still remain unexplained. Detectives have attempted to decode the phrases for decades. They compared the words with crime scenes, military records, locations where Kraft had worked or traveled. Sometimes the phrases appeared to match. Sometimes they led nowhere. One detective described the list as a puzzle built inside a killer's mind. Only Randy Kraft knew the true meaning behind each entry, and he has never explained them. That silence has fueled endless debate among criminologists. Some experts believe the scorecard represented a form of personal pride, a record of what he had accomplished. Others believe it was a private memory system, a way to recall each crime. But there is another possibility. Some investigators believe the list may not even represent the full number of victims. It may only represent the ones he chose to remember. Which raises an even darker question. What about the victims who never made it onto the list? When detectives studied Kraft's behavior, they noticed something chilling. He appeared to live two completely separate lives. During the day, he worked. He socialized. He attended gatherings. Friends described him as intelligent and composed. Someone who enjoyed conversations about politics and technology. Someone who could speak calmly for hours without raising his voice. But at night, something changed. He drove long stretches of highway, often alone, searching, waiting, watching the roadside for potential victims. Psychologists call this kind of behavior compartmentalization, the ability to divide life into separate mental worlds. One normal, one hidden. For Randy Kraft, that hidden world contained unimaginable violence. And yet, he managed to keep those worlds separate for years. One former detective later reflected on how disturbing that ability was. He said the case forced investigators to confront a terrifying truth. Most people assume evil is obvious. Something loud. Something chaotic. Something easy to recognize. But real life doesn't always work that way. Sometimes evil is quiet, organized, patient. Sometimes it wears the face of a polite neighbor, a coworker, a friendly stranger offering a ride. Today, Randy Kraft is an old man. The decades have passed. The long hair and youthful appearance from his arrest photographs are gone. Time has changed him physically, but the crimes remain frozen in history. And the questions remain just as haunting as they were on the night he was arrested. Investigators still revisit the case from time to time. New detectives study the files. Young officers read through reports written before they were even born, trying to understand what happened, trying to learn from it. Because cases like this leave behind lessons. Not comfortable lessons, but necessary ones. They remind investigators how easily predators can hide inside normal life. How vulnerable some people become when society forgets about them. And how small moments can change everything. If those two highway patrol officers had not noticed that drifting car in 1983, the investigation might never have begun. Another victim might have disappeared that same night. Another entry might have been added to the scorecard. But fate intervened. A routine traffic stop exposed something horrifying. A secret that had remained hidden for more than a decade. And even though Randy Kraft was eventually captured, the full story may never be completely known. Some victims remain unidentified. Some crimes remain unconfirmed. And the man responsible continues to deny everything. Which means the final truth may be locked forever inside his mind. But perhaps the most disturbing part of the story is not just the crimes themselves. It is the realization that for years, the killer was just another driver on the highway. Another face in traffic. Another person passing by unnoticed. Until one quiet night, the darkness inside that car was finally revealed. And when investigators looked inside, they discovered something that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. A reminder that sometimes the most terrifying crimes are not the ones committed in sudden bursts of violence, but the ones carried out slowly, patiently, over years, by someone who understood exactly how to hide in plain sight. And even now, long after the trial ended, one chilling question still lingers in the minds of those who studied the case. How many stories like this remain buried, waiting for the moment when someone finally notices something slightly out of place? On a dark road, in the middle of the night. Even today, long after the headlines faded, the case continues to haunt those who studied it. Some detectives have said that certain investigations never truly leave you. You close the files. You move on to other cases. But something about the story stays in your mind. A detail. A photograph. A victim's face. For the investigators who worked the Randy Kraft case, it was often the silence that lingered the longest. The silence of the highways where many of the victims were found. Long stretches of asphalt cutting through empty land. Places where the wind moves through dry grass, and the only sound at night is the occasional passing truck. Those roads had witnessed something terrible. And for years, no one realized it. When detectives reconstructed the timeline of Kraft's suspected killings, they noticed something that deeply unsettled them. The crimes appeared to follow the rhythm of ordinary life. There were periods when the murders stopped for months. Times when Kraft seemed to be living normally. Working. Socializing. Attending events. Then suddenly, another victim would appear. A body discovered beside a road. Sometimes hundreds of miles away from the previous one. This pattern suggested something important about the killer's psychology. These crimes were not uncontrolled outbursts. They were decisions. Calculated moments when Kraft chose to hunt. And that realization made the case even more disturbing. Because it meant the killings could have continued indefinitely. One detective later said something that captured the horror of the situation perfectly. He explained that if Kraft had been slightly more careful on the night of his arrest, if the officers had arrived just a few minutes later, if the body in the passenger seat had been hidden somewhere else, the case might never have been solved. Instead, the killer might have driven away, and the next victim might have been waiting somewhere along the road. Perhaps a hitchhiker trying to reach another city. Perhaps a young man leaving a military base for the weekend. Perhaps someone simply trusting the wrong stranger at the wrong moment. That thought stayed with investigators for years, because it revealed how fragile the line between safety and danger can sometimes be. A single decision, a single encounter, a single ride offered by someone who appears harmless. During the decades that followed the trial, criminologists studied the Kraft case closely. It became one of the most complex serial murder investigations in American history, not only because of the suspected number of victims, but because of the psychological contradictions involved. Randy Kraft did not fit the traditional stereotype of a violent offender. He was educated, articulate, organized. People who met him often described him as intelligent and polite. He did not display the chaotic behavior many people associate with violent criminals. Instead, he appeared calm, methodical, almost analytical. That combination of traits forced investigators to confront an uncomfortable truth. Danger does not always look dangerous. Sometimes it looks calm. Sometimes it looks intelligent. Sometimes it looks exactly like the person sitting next to you in traffic. And that realization is part of what made the case so unsettling, because it reminded investigators that the world does not always reveal its darkest secrets easily. They often remain hidden for years, waiting until something finally exposes them. For the families of the victims, time has moved forward in a different way. Birthdays passed. Holidays came and went. Some parents who lost sons during the 1970s have since grown old. Some passed away before learning the full truth about what happened to their children. Others still visit memorials, still keep photographs, still wonder about the final moments their loved ones experienced. Those unanswered questions are part of what makes crimes like this so devastating. Because even after the killer is caught, the damage does not simply disappear. Lives remain permanently altered. Families remain incomplete. And the silence left behind by the victims never truly fades. Today, Randy Kraft remains incarcerated inside San Quentin State Prison. His appeals continue through the slow machinery of the legal system. Year after year, decade after decade. And throughout all that time, he has never provided the answers investigators hoped for. He has never explained the scorecard, never confirmed the identities behind those coded phrases, never described the full number of victims. Those secrets remain locked inside his mind. Perhaps they will remain there forever, which means that some parts of the story may never be fully understood. But the lessons from the case remain painfully clear. It showed how easily predators can exploit trust, how vulnerable some people become when they are isolated or forgot, and how ordinary life can sometimes hide extraordinary darkness. For many investigators, one image from the case still stands above all the others. The moment when the flashlight beam entered the car during that routine traffic stop in 1983. A quiet highway, two officers standing beside a vehicle, and a body sitting silently in the passenger seat. That moment ended a killing spree that may have lasted more than a decade. But it also revealed something deeply disturbing about human nature. Because the man behind the wheel did not look panicked. He did not look violent. He did not look like the monster investigators had been searching for. He looked calm, ordinary, almost forgettable. And perhaps that is the most chilling truth of all. Sometimes the people capable of the darkest crimes are the ones who seem the most normal, the ones who blend perfectly into the world around them, the ones no one suspects, until the moment the truth finally emerges from the shadows. And by then, for many victims, it is already far too late. The years kept moving forward. New crimes filled police reports. New investigations demanded attention. But the story of Randy Kraft never completely disappeared. Every few years, a documentary would revisit the case. A journalist would reopen the old files. A criminologist would study the patterns again. And each time, the same chilling realization surfaced. The investigation had uncovered only part of the truth. Not the whole story. Because even after decades of work, there were still empty spaces in the timeline. Gaps where victims might exist, but had never been identified. Detectives sometimes returned to the evidence storage rooms where the case files were kept. Large cardboard boxes labeled with case numbers. Inside were photographs from crime scenes discovered along lonely highways. Some of the pictures showed dry hillsides. Others showed quiet rural roads. Ordinary places that looked completely harmless in daylight. But investigators knew what had happened there. They knew that somewhere along those roads, a young man had trusted the wrong person, accepted a ride, climbed into a car, and vanished. In the years after the trial, law enforcement agencies across the United States began studying serial crime patterns more closely. Cases like Kraft's helped change how investigators approached missing persons reports. Before the 1980s, many disappearances, especially involving hitchhikers or runaways, received very little attention. Jurisdiction boundaries often prevented police departments from sharing information effectively. One victim might be found in one county. Another victim discovered hundreds of miles away. And the cases would never be connected. The Kraft investigation helped expose how dangerous that system was. Afterward, databases were created that allowed police departments to share information more easily. Missing persons could now be entered into national systems. DNA databases could link evidence from different states. Those changes would later help solve many other cases. But for the victims connected to Randy Kraft, those improvements came too late. Their stories had already ended, and many of them had disappeared in an era when information traveled slowly. Some families never even knew their loved ones had been found. Others never reported them missing because they believed they had simply left to start a new life somewhere else. That tragic misunderstanding meant some victims remained unidentified for decades. Investigators sometimes described the case as a puzzle with missing pieces. They could see the shape of the crime. They could see the pattern. But they could never fill every gap. One retired detective once explained it this way. He said solving a case normally gives investigators a sense of closure, a feeling that justice has been delivered. But the Kraft case never felt completely finished, because there were still names missing from the story, still faces that had never been identified, still questions that no one could answer. And the only person who knew the full truth refused to speak. Over the years, criminologists also began analyzing the psychological elements of the crimes in greater depth. They studied the photographs, the scorecard, the timeline of events, and they tried to understand the motivation behind the brutality. Some experts believed Kraft displayed extreme narcissistic traits, a need to feel superior, a desire to treat victims as objects rather than human beings. Others pointed to the possibility of sadistic personality traits, a psychological condition where an individual experiences pleasure from the suffering of others. But no single theory fully explained the case. Because human behavior, especially violent behavior, is rarely simple. Sometimes it is the result of many factors layered together. Personality, experience, opportunity, environment. Whatever the explanation, the outcome was the same. Dozens of lives destroyed. Families left searching for answers. And a long trail of crimes stretching across the highways of the western United States. Today, those highways are busier than ever. Thousands of vehicles pass through them every day. Most drivers are focused on ordinary things. Work, family, reaching their destination. Very few of them realize that decades ago, those same roads were the hunting ground of one of the most disturbing killers in modern history. But the memory of those crimes remains preserved in the records of investigators, in court transcripts, in the testimonies of witnesses who saw victims shortly before they disappeared, and in the quiet determination of cold case detectives who continue to search for answers even now. Because for them, the case is not just about the killer. It is about the victims, the young men whose lives were taken in the darkness, the stories that ended beside empty roads, the families who spent years wondering what happened, and the hope that one day, every name on that mysterious scorecard might finally be understood. But until that day comes, the case remains one of the most chilling reminders of how darkness can hide within ordinary life. A reminder that sometimes the most dangerous predators are not the ones who look frightening. They are the ones who appear completely normal. The ones who smile politely, offer help, offer a ride, and disappear into the night before anyone realizes what has happened. And perhaps that is the reason this case continues to disturb people even today. Because it forces us to confront a question that is difficult to answer. A question that investigators themselves struggled with for years. If someone like Randy Kraft could hide among ordinary people for more than a decade, driving the same roads, living the same routines, smiling the same polite smile, then how many other secrets might still exist in the world around us? How many stories remain hidden, waiting for the moment when a small detail finally reveals the truth? Because sometimes the line between normal life and unimaginable darkness is far thinner than anyone wants to believe. As the decades continued to pass, the Randy Kraft case slowly moved from an active investigation into something darker, something more historical. A case studied, analyzed, revisited by new generations of detectives and criminologists, trying to understand how such a long chain of violence could remain hidden for so many years. Training academies sometimes referenced the investigation when teaching young officers about serial crime patterns. Not because the case had been fully solved, but because of what it revealed. It showed how predators adapt, how they learn from their mistakes, and how they exploit weaknesses in the system. During the 1970s, communication between police departments was limited. If a body was found in one county, the detectives working that scene might never know that another similar case existed 200 miles away. The killer understood that, whether consciously or instinctively, bodies appeared in different jurisdictions, different counties, sometimes even different states. Each investigation started from the beginning, each detective working with only part of the picture. And in the gaps between those investigations, the killer continued moving, continued hunting. But over time, law enforcement changed. Cases like this forced agencies to improve how they shared information. National databases were created. Missing persons reports could now be accessed across state lines. DNA evidence could connect crimes separated by hundreds of miles. Those improvements came partly because of investigations like this one. Because investigators realized something terrifying. A serial killer can move faster than the system designed to catch them, unless the system evolves. Even today, criminal profilers sometimes study Randy Kraft when discussing organized offenders. Killers who plan carefully, who leave very little evidence, who maintain stable public lives while secretly committing violent crimes. Those cases are often the hardest to solve, because nothing about the suspect appears suspicious. Friends see a polite coworker. Neighbors see a quiet resident. Strangers see a helpful driver offering a ride. No one sees the hidden life unfolding behind closed doors. In many ways, that was the greatest advantage Randy Kraft had. Normality. It allowed him to exist unnoticed, while his victims disappeared along dark highways. And for years, no one connected the dots. No one realized that a single individual might be responsible for so many deaths. But eventually, the pattern became impossible to ignore. And eventually, one small moment changed everything. A drifting car, a routine traffic stop, a flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, and a discovery that shocked even experienced officers. A dead man sitting silently in the passenger seat. For investigators, that moment remains one of the most dramatic turning points in criminal history, because it ended a killing spree that may have lasted more than 12 years. But it also revealed how fragile the line between freedom and capture can sometimes be. If the driver had chosen a different road, if the officers had been dispatched somewhere else, if the traffic stop had never happened, the story might have continued. More victims, more entries on the scorecard, more families searching for answers. Today, the prison walls surrounding Randy Kraft remain strong and silent. Inside them sits a man who once traveled thousands of miles across the western United States. A man whose secrets may never fully be revealed. A man whose crimes forced investigators to confront some of the darkest questions about human behavior. But outside those walls, life continues. The highways are still there. Cars still pass through the same stretches of road where victims were once discovered. Drivers stop at gas stations. Travelers accept rides. Strangers cross paths for only a few moments before continuing on their way. Most of the time, those encounters are harmless. But the story of Randy Kraft remains a chilling reminder that sometimes they are not. Because history has shown that the most dangerous predators are not always the ones hiding in shadows. Sometimes they are the ones driving quietly beside us, blending perfectly into the flow of everyday life. And that realization leaves behind a question that still echoes long after the case itself faded from headlines. A question investigators have asked themselves for decades. How many crimes remain hidden simply because the right person was never stopped? How many victims vanish without leaving enough clues to reveal the truth? And how many killers continue moving through the world unnoticed, until the moment when a small detail finally exposes them? In the end, the story of Randy Kraft is not just about one man. It is about the fragile trust that exists between strangers, the risks people take without realizing it, and the uncomfortable truth that sometimes the greatest dangers are not obvious at all. They sit quietly behind the wheel, driving through the darkness, waiting until someone places their trust in the wrong hands. And by the time the truth finally emerges, the road behind them has already become a graveyard of forgotten stories. Time has a strange way of reshaping even the darkest stories. What once dominated headlines slowly becomes a chapter in history. New tragedies appear, new investigations begin, and the old cases quietly settle into archives and court records. But some cases refuse to fade completely. The story of Randy Kraft is one of them. Because when investigators look back at it, they don't just see a serial killer. They see a warning. A reminder of how easily violence can hide beneath ordinary life. Long after the trial ended, detectives who had worked the case continued speaking about one detail that never stopped bothering them. The routine. Kraft didn't live like someone constantly running from the law. He followed a schedule. He maintained jobs. He attended social gatherings. He had conversations about politics and technology. He laughed. He shook hands. He existed in the same world as everyone else. And then, sometimes late at night, he would leave that world behind. He would drive. Long stretches of highway. Miles of empty road. Places where headlights were the only light cutting through the darkness. And somewhere along those roads, he would encounter a stranger. Someone vulnerable. Someone alone. Someone who believed they had just found a ride. That moment of trust was all it took. Investigators believe many of the victims never realized the danger they were in until it was too late. The drugs. The alcohol. The calm voice of the man driving the car. By the time the situation became frightening, resistance was nearly impossible. That realization is part of what made the case so horrifying. Because the victims were not simply attacked, they were manipulated. Their trust was used against them. And for years, that pattern repeated again and again. Across cities, across counties, across state lines. When criminologists studied the case later, they often described Kraft as an example of the organized serial offender. Someone capable of planning carefully. Someone who controlled the crime scene. Someone who left minimal evidence behind. But even that label did not fully explain the brutality involved. Because organization alone does not explain cruelty. And cruelty was a defining feature of these crimes. The suffering inflicted on the victims was not accidental. It was intentional. Slow. Deliberate. The kind of violence that forces investigators to confront uncomfortable truths about human psychology. Some detectives admitted they struggled to understand how a person could commit such acts repeatedly without showing remorse. How someone could return to everyday life afterward as if nothing had happened. Yet that was exactly what Randy Kraft appeared to do. Day after day. Year after year. Until one night in 1983. When everything finally stopped. A routine patrol. 2 highway officers. A drifting car. And a moment of suspicion. The officers approached the vehicle, expecting something minor. Maybe a drunk driver. Maybe someone tired after a long trip. Instead, they discovered something that instantly changed the course of the investigation. A dead man sitting silently in the passenger seat. That discovery ended a killing spree that may have stretched across more than a decade. But even as the investigation closed in on Kraft, the deeper questions remained unanswered. How many victims had there truly been? What did each phrase on the scorecard mean? Were there crimes that investigators never even discovered? Those questions still linger today. Because Randy Kraft has never provided the answers. He has never confessed, never explained, never revealed the full story behind the coded list investigators found in his possession. And without those answers, parts of the case remain forever incomplete. For the families of the victims, that silence is perhaps the most painful part. Justice was delivered in a courtroom. But closure is something different. Closure requires understanding. And understanding requires truth. Yet the man who holds that truth continues to keep it locked away. Perhaps out of control. Perhaps out of indifference. Perhaps because revealing it would force him to confront the reality of what he did. No one can know for certain. What investigators do know is this: the highways where many of the victims disappeared still exist. People still travel those roads every day. They pass through the same exits, the same quiet stretches of asphalt, most of them unaware of the dark history hidden beneath those miles. But the detectives who worked the case remember. They remember the photographs, the evidence, the moment when the truth was finally revealed inside that car. And they remember the lesson the case left behind. A lesson that continues to shape how modern investigations work today. Because the story of Randy Kraft taught law enforcement something important. Evil does not always appear violent at first glance. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in the form of a stranger offering help, a driver offering a ride, a polite voice saying everything will be fine, until suddenly it is. And by the time the truth becomes clear, the road behind them has already disappeared into darkness, leaving only unanswered questions, unidentified victims, and one final thought that still unsettles investigators decades later. If that patrol car had never noticed a small mistake on a quiet highway in 1983, the killings might never have stopped, and the scorecard inside Randy Kraft's briefcase might have continued growing, one name at a time. Even now, when the case is discussed in criminal justice circles, one question always returns. Not just what happened, but how it happened for so long. How a man could travel across states, meet dozens of victims, leave bodies along highways, and still return home to live a normal life. Investigators have spent decades studying that question, because understanding it might help stop the next killer before the list of victims grows. One of the most unsettling discoveries in the Kraft investigation was how ordinary the world around him continued to be. While detectives searched deserts, forests, and roadsides for bodies, life in the cities went on. People went to work. Families ate dinner. Friends gathered at bars and restaurants. And somewhere in that ordinary world, Randy Kraft blended in perfectly. That ability to disappear into normal life is something criminal profilers now consider one of the most dangerous traits a serial offender can possess. Because the more ordinary someone appears, the longer they can continue. In the years after his arrest, journalists occasionally attempted to interview Kraft. Some hoped he might finally explain the meaning of the scorecard. Others hoped he might confess. But those conversations rarely revealed anything useful. Kraft remained calm, detached. He answered questions carefully, and he continued to deny responsibility for the murders. For many investigators, that denial was deeply frustrating, because somewhere in his memory were the answers they had been searching for. The identities behind the coded phrases, the full timeline of the killings, the real number of victims. But those answers never came. And as the years passed, detectives began to accept something difficult. Some parts of the story might never be known. The scorecard may always remain partially unsolved. Some victims may never be identified. And some families may never learn the truth about what happened to the people they lost. But even without those answers, the case changed the way law enforcement investigates serial crime. Today, police departments share information more quickly. DNA databases connect evidence across state lines. Missing persons reports are tracked nationally. Patterns can be detected much earlier. Those systems exist partly because cases like this forced investigators to rethink everything. They realized that killers who travel long distances cannot be stopped by isolated investigations. Only cooperation can stop them. In that sense, the tragedy of the Kraft case helped build tools that protect people today. But that does not erase the past. The victims remain at the center of the story. Young men whose lives ended on dark highways. Some were soldiers. Some were students. Some were travelers searching for opportunity. Each one had a future that disappeared in a single moment of misplaced trust. And perhaps that is the most haunting part of the case. It was built on ordinary human behavior. Trust, the simple act of accepting help from a stranger. Something people do every day. Most of the time, that trust is safe. But sometimes it is. For detectives who worked the investigation, one memory stands above all the others. The moment when the flashlight beam entered that car during the traffic stop in 1983. A quiet highway. The sound of passing vehicles in the distance. And the realization that something terrible had been sitting in that passenger seat. That moment ended a killing spree that may have lasted more than 12 years. But it also revealed a truth that investigators would never forget. The world does not always reveal its dangers clearly. Sometimes the greatest threats move silently through ordinary life. Driving the same roads, living in the same neighborhoods, smiling the same polite smile, until the moment when a small detail finally exposes the truth. And when that truth emerges, it forces everyone to confront a disturbing possibility. That someone capable of unimaginable cruelty might have been standing beside us all along. Hidden in plain sight. Waiting. And the only thing that finally stopped him was a routine patrol car noticing a driver who drifted slightly across a lane on a dark California highway. A tiny mistake. A single moment of suspicion. And suddenly, one of the most disturbing killing sprees in modern history came to an end. But the questions it raised about human nature, about trust, and about the darkness that sometimes hides behind an ordinary face. Those questions may never truly disappear. Because even today, when investigators look back at the case, one thought still sends a chill down their spine. If that traffic stop had never happened, the scorecard might still be growing. One victim, after another, after another. Even decades later, the story refuses to fade completely. For many investigators, the Kraft case is more than a historical example of a serial killer. It is a haunting reminder of human vulnerability and of how easily evil can hide beneath ordinary life. They reflect on the ordinary roads where the crimes occurred, the highways stretching through California, Oregon, and beyond, roads that today carry thousands of vehicles each day, most drivers completely unaware of the dark history beneath their tires. The victims, though gone, continue to occupy the investigators' minds. Young men who trusted a stranger, men whose lives were snatched away in moments of misplaced faith, soldiers, students, travelers, all ordinary people whose fates were sealed by a predator who blended seamlessly into the world around him. Criminal profilers still study Kraft's behavior as a textbook example of organized, methodical serial murder. How someone can compartmentalize life. How a person can maintain normal relationships and a polite demeanor while committing atrocities in private. How patience, intelligence, and normality can mask the most horrifying crimes. For those who examine the case, one chilling truth emerges above all others. Evil is not always obvious. It does not always scream for attention. Often it is quiet, polite, intelligent, ordinary, waiting, patient. Even after Kraft was convicted, questions persisted. How many victims were never identified? How many entries on the scorecard remain unexplained? Did the full number of killings ever come to light? These uncertainties continue to haunt law enforcement and the families of the victims. Yet the case also shaped modern investigative practices. Today, missing persons and homicide cases are shared across state lines. DNA evidence can connect crimes that once would have remained isolated. The mistakes that allowed Kraft to operate for more than a decade have informed training and procedures designed to prevent future killers from exploiting similar vulnerabilities. Still, the human cost cannot be erased. Families continue to grieve, sometimes decades later. The absence of answers, the empty spaces where loved ones should be, remains profoundly painful. For the investigators, the images and evidence stay with them, reminders of what was lost and what was nearly lost. The roads where Kraft traveled are still there. The highways where his victims vanished continue to carry the rhythms of daily life. But for those who remember the case, those stretches of asphalt are no longer ordinary. They are reminders that danger can be silent, that ordinary trust can be exploited, that evil can move unnoticed among the normal world. And perhaps the most disturbing lesson of all, sometimes the most terrifying person in the room, the one capable of unimaginable acts, is the one who looks perfectly ordinary, the one who smiles politely, drives responsibly, and blends effortlessly into everyday life. Until one day, a small mistake, a random check, a moment of suspicion, and suddenly the darkness is revealed. Randy Kraft's crimes were stopped. Justice was served in a courtroom. Yet the questions remain, the victims' stories linger, and the memory of the highways where it all happened continues to warn us. Evil often hides in plain sight, and the line between normal life and unimaginable horror is far thinner than anyone wants to believe. Because in the end, the terrifying truth endures. The most dangerous people are sometimes those who appear the least dangerous. And the moments that save lives may come down to nothing more than a brief glance, a cautious suspicion, or a traffic stop in the dead of night. One small moment can make the difference between life and death. And sometimes, it is the only thing standing between the ordinary world and unimaginable darkness. Even now, decades later, the echoes of those crimes linger. For the families of the victims, life has never returned to normal. Birthdays pass, holidays come and go. Memories of young men who disappeared too soon remain frozen in time. Some parents grew old carrying uncertainty, never knowing what truly happened to their sons. Others finally received closure when DNA and forensic advances identified remains long after the crimes. But for many, answers never came. Some names on Kraft's scorecard may remain forever unknown. For the detectives who pursued him, the case never really ended. Every quiet highway, every empty roadside, carries the memory of a young man who vanished, trusting the wrong person. Even now, new officers study the case, dissecting every detail, every pattern, trying to learn from the mistakes of the past. They study Kraft not just as a killer, but as a lesson in how patience, intelligence, and ordinary appearance can hide unimaginable violence. And yet, despite all the evidence, the conviction, the prison walls that now hold him, the ultimate truth remains partially obscured. Kraft has never revealed the full meaning of the scorecard. He has never confessed to every act. He has never explained the depth of his cruelty or the complete number of victims. That silence keeps part of the story locked away, a terrifying reminder that evil often keeps its secrets well. Criminologists still debate his motives, psychologists still study his behaviors, and investigators still wonder, how many victims remain unidentified? How many more could there have been? And how many killers like him are still out there, blending into the ordinary world waiting? The roads where his crimes occurred are still traveled every day. Cars speed past the empty fields, the dry hillsides, the quiet stretches of highway. Drivers laugh, sing along to the radio, talk on their phones, unaware that decades ago, these same roads were the hunting grounds of a man who turned ordinary trust into fatal danger. Perhaps the most chilling lesson of all is that evil does not always announce itself. It can wear a polite smile. It can follow a schedule. It can appear calm, intelligent, and ordinary. And it can hide in plain sight for years, even decades, until one small, almost insignificant moment exposes it. A drifting car on a dark highway, a vigilant officer noticing something just slightly off, a traffic stop that changes everything. Randy Kraft's story is a reminder that the ordinary world can sometimes conceal the unimaginable. That trust can be exploited. That danger can exist where it seems least likely. Those moments of awareness, no matter how small, can make the difference between life and death. And perhaps the most enduring truth of all is this: The victims' lives, though stolen, continue to teach us about vulnerability, about caution, and about the fragile line between normal life and unimaginable darkness. Even now, the highways remain, the scorecard remains, the memory remains, and the question that haunts investigators, criminologists, and families alike endures: how many more moments of vigilance could save lives before the darkness strikes again? Because in the end, the most terrifying truth is not that evil exists, but that it can hide anywhere, behind anyone, waiting for the briefest lapse of attention to strike. And sometimes, it takes only a single, fleeting moment to prevent it. The end is never clean, the questions were never fully answered, the shadows never completely lifted, but through remembering, through studying, through vigilance, we honor the victims, and we remind ourselves that even in the darkest moments, awareness can be the only light standing between life and death. And so, the story comes full circle. The highways stretch on, the fields remain silent, the towns carry on their routines, cars pass, oblivious to the history of fear and violence that once unfolded along the same asphalt. And somewhere in the world, someone still trusts a stranger. The victims' voices, though silenced in life, echo through time. Each photograph, each report, each entry on the infamous scorecard is a reminder that even in a seemingly ordinary world, horror can exist quietly. That lives can end in a single, misplaced moment of trust. That danger is not always obvious, and evil does not always announce itself. Randy Kraft sits behind prison walls, his freedom gone, yet the questions linger. The full extent of his crimes may never be known. Some victims remain unidentified. Some families never learn the truth. And the scorecard, a silent ledger of death, continues to haunt the imagination of those who study it. But there is a lesson here, painful, unsettling, and essential. Awareness matters. Vigilance matters. A single second of caution, a moment of suspicion, a flashlight cutting through darkness, can stop a tragedy before it begins. It may be the difference between life and death. Even decades later, the Kraft case teaches us something fundamental about human nature. The most dangerous threats often appear harmless. They smile, they speak politely, they follow ordinary routines. They live among us, invisible in plain sight. And when the moment is right, they strike. The darkness, however, is not invincible. One night in 1983, a brief moment of attention, a routine patrol, a simple stop saved countless lives. It revealed the hidden evil, halted the spree, and finally brought the truth into the light. But the story does not end there. The echoes remain, the questions remain, the highways remain, and the chilling reality persists. Evil can hide anywhere, behind anyone, waiting for the one small lapse of awareness to continue its work. For the victims, the families, the investigators, and the world, the Kraft case is not just a story of death. It is a story of caution, of vigilance, of humanity's vulnerability. A story that forces us to ask, when danger is hidden in plain sight, will we notice before it is too late? Because the line between ordinary life and unimaginable darkness is thinner than we dare to imagine. And sometimes, the smallest moment, the briefest glance, the slightest hesitation, can be the difference between survival and becoming a name on a scorecard. The highway is quiet now, but the memory is not. The shadows remain, and the lessons endure, waiting for anyone who travels the roads, trusting the ordinary, while the extraordinary darkness lurks just beyond the headlights. The story may have ended for the killer, but it has never ended for the world he touched. For the victims, for the families, for the highways themselves. And for us, it remains a haunting reminder. Humanity is capable of unimaginable evil. And sometimes, it is sitting quietly beside you, waiting for the night to fall. The darkness never truly leaves. It only waits.